Hello, internet. It's warm again. It's still summer, so I expect this, sun. It's back. Don't know if you wanted it, but I needed it, so it's back. For those of you who are relatively new to my channel or didn't watch these videos before, I have been looking at movie romances because I hate them and how they work in different genres and doing a case study around it. Now, I'm doing this because it's relevant to an upcoming work in progress, but also in conjunction with my studies because I look at narrative. So that's what this is. I've been looking at 5 films per genre, 2 that are considered exemplary, 2 that are not great to bad, and a parody to sort of see which aspects of romance, which tropes the genre plays up. I don't know if I'm gleaning any insight, but you know. So today's genre is historical fiction, or as I like to call it, seriously? Marriage? Already? I think this is like one of the most cliche romance genres. If you have a historical fiction, film, book, whatever, it's gonna have a romance in it. So I wanted to pick the most cliche time period. And the first thing that popped into my head was Victorian England or medieval England. For any one genre, it was difficult for me to find 2 good, 2 bad, and 1 funny that fit my parameters. And even if I could, those movies used supernatural elements or were based in folklore or were massive epics that didn't really work. So what I ended up doing is I had to combine medieval and early modern England, and I did it because these are 2 time periods that movies mix up all the time. They're kind of conflated in public mind, but it's also the time period that I studied for my history BA. That's where my experience is, and I could tear their inaccuracies apart. These are the films that I will be spoiling, and I will be spoiling them. Lovely chair, right? As always, let's get just some statistics out of the way based on the parameters of my original video. 2 out of the 5 romances had a happy ending. 1 out of the 5 were unnecessary, and 2 were distracting. Now, the movie that was unnecessary and one of the films that were distracting was because it was a comedy and the romance was obligatory. There was one other distracting romance, and I'll get to that in a second. I've talked before, I think I talked about it in my sci-fi video, I talked about it in my fantasy video. There's something about movie romances that they just jump in way too quickly. There's no natural setup to a relationship. People meet and they get together without much ado. One of the things that I noticed in historical fiction is the sheer amount of love that they fall into on first meeting. And one of the things I noticed is the performance of romance. And that doesn't mean performativity of romance, although it can, but the way that these actors performed being in love was so over the top, it just felt unnatural and it felt theatrical. Sometimes that theatricality worked. In Robin Hood, which was released in 1938, theatricality was just the way that people acted. So even though Errol Flynn goes ha 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 super unnaturally like throughout the entire movie, once you get past that and you get to the romance, it doesn't feel out of place because the entire thing is theatrical. On the other hand, you get something like Shakespeare in Love, which was just sort of weird. He falls so deeply in love with her after looking into her eyes once in a dance and is suddenly chasing after her, doing everything he possibly can and writing about her like she's his muse. Now, of course, she has been a fangirl, so her infatuation with him kind of makes sense, but his with her was just way too much, way too quickly. And this was the distraction I was talking about. When they're trying to act and he takes her hand and starts kissing it and she basically starts acting like she's having an orgasm right there on the spot, that's not necessary. Couples that just can't get their hands off each other generally is really annoying, and it didn't seem romantic, it seemed way too much. Now, what ended up happening was this theatricality worked in the movie's favor at the end when they're performing Romeo and Juliet. That performance was excellent. It was mesmerizing, and it worked because that sort of theatricality had been in their relationship the whole time. But where it works in a theater performance, it doesn't work in real life. It really takes you out of the film. That theatricality doesn't just stop at theatrical performances. In The Other Boleyn Girl, there's a real theatricality to the way Anne approaches Henry, and that makes sense because she's trying to seduce him, but Mary has a husband, she's being forced into this role, and she falls in love with him very fast. Honestly, I don't know where that line was, if it was the first time they kissed, but suddenly she's like, but I love him. But why? You've slept with him once? You don't know him, and I don't understand her insistence that she needs to be with him forever when there wasn't much evidence of that before. And the fact that she had a husband who's literally never brought up again after he's like, what if I sent your husband away? He died, by the way. In real life, her husband was dead. He died in like 15, 20 28, but they never mention that in the film. You're just supposed to forget about it. And maybe at the time it was fine, but these days, that's Benedict freaking Cumberbatch. People watching this movie go like, wait, where did Benedict Cumberbatch go? It's so distracting and it's weird. The most egregious example of this does not come from the court jester, even though the court jester has a bit of this as well. They're lying together and suddenly they're talking about marriage. Wait, marriage? Yeah, he sees her in a dress. She's like, oh, she's a woman, and starts making googly eyes at her. Fine. Then she hears him singing to a baby. They lie next to each other. It's cute. And then he's like, oh, but I'll marry you. And it's like, no. And that's weird in itself. First Night takes this sort of they meet marriage to the extreme. It starts off as a very cliche rescue romance. Seriously, they wanted to fit as many cliches as they possibly could in the first 30 minutes of that movie. It starts off as a cliche rescue romance. He tackles her to the ground, saves her life, all is great. And there's that whole conversation about how can I reward you? And he's saying, oh, but you'll be my reward. Okay. Then they immediately start talking about, well, I can't marry you. I'm engaged. Marriage! I understand that like knights have this whole thing where like my reward is a kiss from the lovely lady, but marriage! You met 10 minutes ago. So ridiculous. It's way too much. Also, to quote Ted Danson from The Good Place, stop mashing your food holes together. The way they kiss in that movie, and this goes for Shakespeare in Love too. It's not sexy, it's not romantic, it's gross. Your lips are like, you know? But just like there's a theatricality to the way that love is portrayed, there is a performativity in some parts. There is a lot of manipulation in these movies. In The Court Jester, it's silly, because this is a comedy. She's manipulating the king into being obsessed with her so that she can steal the king, and then manipulating him into not wanting her anymore so that she can get out of the room and not have to have sex with him. It's played for laughs, very low-key. In The Other Boleyn Girl, this seduction is taken up to 11, and Anne has Henry wrapped around her little finger, and it's awesome. Look at this and you're like, yeah, she's manipulating the crap out of him, and his love for her would be like really out of place and way too much. But it's Henry VIII, and God, that man was horny all the time. Like, I believe that. Maybe this is the one instance where I believe that jumping into love way too quickly, because it's him and all he wanted was the sex. He'd do anything for it. What a terrible man. Where this performativity of romance really got to me was again in First Night. Richard Gere comes off as sleazy and arrogant, and his character is manipulative and terrible. And yes, I understand the double standard there. I acknowledge it. But there's also a couple of rapey connotations with a man trying to manipulate a woman into kissing him, putting it out there. But on top of that, one of the things that The Court Jester and The Other Boleyn Girl had that Lancelot didn't is that Henry and Roderick wanted the sex. But on the Lancelot side, yes, she loves him, and it's made very clear several times throughout the movie. She says, I don't want you. I am engaged. I cannot be with you. No, go away. And he still tries to manipulate the situation. He joins King Arthur's knights, competes in a tournament where the prize is a kiss just so she'd be forced to kiss him. Like, terrible behavior, and they're allowed to potentially end up together at the end. No. I know it's Lancelot and Guinevere, and they're meant to be, and he has character development and realizes that that's not what he can do, and that's when she finally decides to kiss him. But they get to that point because he's been trying to manipulate her, and she's said no. That is not acceptable, and it bothered the crap out of me. Yeah, that's my discussion of historical fiction romances. This was a lot of falling too far in love too quickly rather than just falling in love too quickly, and that sort of theatricality that took away from the performances. Now, before I go, for those of you who don't know, at the end of these videos, I always award my favorite couple. Now, this is the one that I shipped the most. This is going to be a little bit difficult for this video because I didn't ship a single one of them, but I suppose the closest I can get is The Court Jester because they do have a very sweet mutual romance with no manipulation involved at all. It's nice. Because of the way that fantasy, sci-fi, and historical fiction had romances that just jumped in way too quickly, for my last category, and it is the last category for these particular case studies, I want to look at the consequences of someone falling that far in love that quickly. So that's what you can look forward to in a couple of weeks. Yeah, I'm really glad I'm watching movies again. It's helping me write, and it's helping me get back into that mindset, which I really needed after months of just working on a dissertation. Just wanted to say thank you for watching. I hope you liked it. If you did, please hit that like button, but also don't forget to subscribe to my channel. I'd really appreciate it. I've linked all my social medias in the description box below as usual, and I post new videos on Fridays. See you next week. Bye!